Hello and welcome to Encounter. I'm Mike Leiderman. Our guest on this program is a distinguished journalist who has spent a total of 23 years with the Washington Post, including 13 as managing editor during those Watergate years where the Post conducted its historic and award-winning investigation of the Watergate affair. But Howard Simons, our guest, was a Jew before he was a journalist. And his latest project is an examination of the American Jewish experience. Howard Simons has spent 4 years crisscrossing the country, interviewing people from all walks of life, urban, rural, rich, poor, famous, unknown, scholarly, uneducated, the only qualification being that all were Jewish. And the result is Jewish Times. The book is called The Voices of the American Jewish Experience, a collection of oral history that explores the roots of its subjects, indeed explores all of our roots. And Howard Simons, good to have you with us.
It's great to be here.
You did, I called this almost like The Glory of Their Times for Jews, which is the baseball book where the author went and took his tape recorder all around interviewing all the old ball players. Here you're talking to, what, over 200 people?
I interviewed over 200 people.
Well,
they're not all in the book, of course. But,
right. Who made your list?
Well, I started making my initial list a long time ago and knew two categories, people I was after as well as subjects I was after, so that I knew I wanted somebody whose family had been in the United States pre-Revolutionary War, people in the South, both in the South before and after the Civil War, merchants, people who lived in small towns in America, people out west, people in politics. But as I schlepped my little tape recorder across the United States, you'd meet people and they would say, oh, you have to interview my cousin. My cousin grew up with the Sioux Indians and spoke only Siouan for the first 10 months of their life instead of Yiddish. And I then built another list and kept building on lists. Mm-hmm.
Well, what was the goal? I mean, the whole idea?
Well, I've been very proud of, I've sort of basked in two marinades all my life. One is America and the other is being an American and the other is being Jewish. And I wanted to sort of capture my view of this wonderful experience, which I think is a wonderful experience, and that's the American Jewish experience. How did they do it? Where did they come from? What obstacles did they have? What hurdles? What still remains? Mm-hmm. And so I went looking for it, and I wanted it in their voices, not mine. I mean, there have been a number of people who have written marvelous books about the Jewish experience in the United States, but it's always seen through the eyes of the reporter, or the eyes of the author, or the eyes of the professor. I wanted it through the voices of the people. Now, my mother used to tell me Bubamaisis, grandmother tales, and that's what I wanted to capture. That's how I started it. I was going to collect Bubamaisis, or grandmother's tales. Mm-hmm. And it got expanded a little bit and changed its character a little bit, and I ended up with a book.
Jews traditionally have been urban people. You spend an awful lot of time in the backwoods.
Well, that's because I felt that even though I grew up in the Northeast, in Albany, New York, and I grew up in what I would regard as partially a Jewish ghetto, although we didn't realize it was a ghetto until a sociologist told us 20 years later, a very Jewish neighborhood surrounded in an Italian Catholic neighborhood in Albany, New York. There was a larger Jewish community out there that I kept bumping into as I first went into the Army and then became a journalist for 30 years in rural America, in Western America, in southern states, and I didn't know that at all, so I wanted to discover that too.
Give me a couple of examples of some of the...
Well, I mean, I happened to be teaching down at the University of South Carolina, commuting from Harvard, and heard of a man by the name of Solomon Blott, who turned out to be a segregationist Jew, who held the record in the United States for having served as a legislator longer than anyone else in the United States, had been Speaker of a House of an American legislature longer than anyone in the history of the United States, and was the oldest sitting representative of anyone in the United States. And so I went and sought him out, and on his 90th birthday in Barnwell, South Carolina, interviewed him. He subsequently died a few years ago. But this is a very rich history of a man who came, whose wife converted. She was born Jewish and became an Episcopalian long into the marriage. And it was just so rich in history. His father, a peddler who walked to Barnwell from Atlanta, Georgia. And it was just, it's a world so far from Madison and Eagle Streets in Albany, New York,
and
that
yet
I can't tell you.
An ardent segregationist.
And an ardent segregationist.
How did he justify those feelings in view of his own background?
Well, he felt that they should pull the blacks should pull themselves up by their bootstraps the way the Jews did. A not uncommon thread that you will find among some people.
Well, there's a line between that and believing
of
in
course.
separatism.
The other thing is you'll find he felt, for instance, that South Carolina particularly was far more cordial to Jewish politicians than in the North, and I think that's probably true in the earlier days. I mean, you go from small town to small town in the South and find Jewish mayors back in the 19th century. You find Jewish legislators back in the 19th century. Very hard to do that in a lot of northern states.
People think that if you are in an area where there are very few Jews or other minority, you're more apt to be the target of racial or ethnic prejudice. And in fact, that's not the case.
That wasn't my experience. Remember, I have a very limited sample now, and a lot of the generalizations I make would probably not stand up against a true historian's scholarship. But you would find in the South, for instance, which is a good example, that because Jews were the people of the book, that the particularly Baptist ministers would say they're the chosen people and treat them with great respect. I know there's a young man by the name of Jack Bass who grew up in North South Carolina, and Jack tells a wonderful story about his own father. They were the only Jewish family in North South Carolina, and the father would ship off the kids to study Hebrew and go to Sunday school up in Columbia every Sunday. And the Baptist minister would tell his congregation, you look at the Bass children, look how religious they are, that's very important. Then he'd come to Mr. Bass and he'd say, Mr. Bass, please interpret this for me from the Bible. And Mr. Bass didn't know how to interpret the Bible. He'd say, well, let me think about it. And so he'd call the rabbi up in Columbia and say, help. But it was what Harry Golden used to call philo-Semitism. And of course, there was a sort of a love of the chosen people in the South.
What other obscure places did you find Jews?
Oh,
Alaska,
Alaska, for instance. There were many Jews in Alaska. There are today, but there were many who went up there as pioneers and worked the mining fields, were fur trappers. Up in the Mojave Range, where Bob Dylan's family comes from, there were tiny little towns called Virginia and Hibbings and other in the Mojave Range, where there were tiny dollops of Jews. In the Dakotas and in Wyoming and in Montana. And out west, you had said in the beginning that I interviewed people who are still Jews, who identify. There are two major exceptions in my book. One is Senator William Cohen of Maine, and the other was Senator Barry Goldwater. Now, if you talk to Barry Goldwater, he will tell you that he thinks there was less anti-Semitism in the West than in the East, and I think he's probably right. And again, it's because there was no Jewish density, there was no critical Jewish mass, and there were maybe one or two families in a community.
What insights can we get from these people who grew up in small areas that we can apply in our urban or suburban settings?
Well, one thing is that the maintenance of staying Jewish, going to great lengths to do it, getting your kosher. There's a fur family in Anchorage today, the Greens, for instance, and one of them is related to a woman by the name of Zoper, who was back in the mining community and insisted on having kosher meat sent up from Seattle right after World War I, in a tiny mining community in the middle of nowhere. The great strong desire to remain Jewish, not to pass, not to say I'm not Jewish, not to hide, but to stay Jewish is a cement that's very valuable.
And yet here we are in the metropolises or the megalopolises, and many Jews are worried about how to endure by being obscure and how to pass and how to hide.
Well, they ought to then look to their grandparents and great-grandparents, because they did it under much more difficult circumstances. To be sure, there was clumping. Families would send for more family members. There were societies like the Pushalata Society in Jacksonville, Florida, where people from Pushalat would send for their relatives and bring them over and their friends, and so that kind of thing. But there was a great, courageous group of people. As I try to say in my book, I'm haunted by the fact that I don't know if I could have done it, and that is say goodbye to my wife, say goodbye to my children, traveled to an unknown country, penniless without speaking the language, not knowing whether I'll ever get there, and maybe never seeing my family again. That's tough.
You also talk to people who were eyewitnesses to history,
yes,
or who made history. Everybody's got Ellis Island stories, and yet when you tell them when the people you interview tell them, there is a unique freshness
Well, thank you.
to them. And what was, I like the one about the family who goes, 4 different family members go to 4 booths and come out with 4 different last names.
4 different names, yes. I never went back to the original names.
But they were all still related.
Well, you know, I obviously have many more stories than I was able to get in my book. One of my favorite ones that I wasn't able to get in because I only did it with people I did interview, not stories I heard about people. I was told a marvelous story because I'm in love with Jewish humor. I think it's such a rich
Why not?
mine.
Right.
And somebody told me about a doctor who had been a student at Syracuse and second-ranked basketball player on the team. And his mother was going to come visit for the only time in her life to Syracuse. So he went to the coach. He said, please, coach, play me a little more than you usually do. My mother's going to be in the stands. So the coach says, I'll take care of you. And so he keeps him in the whole game. And at the end of the game, the boy runs over and says, Mama, Mama, how did you like that? And she says, your coach is anti-Semitic. He said, what do you mean my coach is anti-Semitic? She says, you he keeps in the whole time. The others he takes out from time to time and gives them a rest. Which is typical.
Has to be. There are some very poignant eyewitness accounts, for example, of the lynching in the South.
Yes, the Frank case.
Talk a little bit about that. Who did you
talk
to?
I went to talk to a young lawyer by the name of Dale Schwartz in Atlanta, Georgia, who had been asked if he would petition the Parole and Pardons Board to get a pardon for Leo Frank, who was the only Jew lynched in the United States, but who symbolically became the person who really sort of the Dreyfus case of the United States. People fled Atlanta, Georgia, because they were so scared that a pogrom was coming on top of them.
Briefly recapping, Leo Frank
was
convicted
Leo Frank was convicted of the murder of a young white girl, Mary Fagan, and in spite of the fact that all the evidence indicated he was absolutely innocent, it took all that time. It was in 1916, I think, but it took 70 years they petitioned to have him pardoned, and Dale Schwartz was the lawyer who went and did it. Now, he then recounted for me the entire case, from, first his own childhood in Georgia, and then the case, and then what happened. And it is an eloquent narrative of, I think, the Leo Frank case.
Which brings up the whole concept of anti-Semitism, which, of course, permeates the book as it has permeated Jewish history.
Life for 5,749 years.
Are you more optimistic now over the situation?
Well, I am more optimistic. However, as I say in the book, I regard anti-Semitism as a latent virus that gets activated from time to time depending on the stimuli applied to the virus. But it's always there. And even in this wonderful country, you'll find from time to time there are anti-Semitic episodes that frighten the community, and properly so. But nonetheless, I find it far less than when I was a child. And I remember interviewing 2 people at once. I didn't do this very often. It's very hard. And many times I would go and interview a husband or a wife, and the other would interfere in the interview by correcting one or the other. Not on surprise, surprise. Right. But I interviewed a young man and a man twice his age. One grew up in what I regard as a classic urban ghetto in St. Louis, and the other one grew up in what I regard as a golden ghetto, the suburbs of the new American city. And their experiences were totally different. The older man fought his way to and from school every day, getting called all kinds of terrible names and being beaten up and having snowballs thrown at him. And the young man didn't experience any of that anti-Semitism. And I think it's indicative that the anti-Semitism has lessened from certainly when I was a child.
Do you find, though, that of the people you interviewed, and again, we're not talking about a factual historian, right, a large sample or whatever, people are less likely to tolerate anti-Semitism today,
yes,
or are they, just to finish the question, or are they less likely to believe that it's possible today because they did experience or have experienced a lot less of it?
I think they are less likely to experience it and less likely to think it can happen again. That doesn't mean it can't. I'm just saying I think that would be a generalization I could make. One indication is in politics, for instance, in this country. For a long time, American Jews would be behind the scenes. They would be managers. They would be part of the poll taking, part of this, part of that. But it was don't run, Shah, don't you know, Shah, my child, don't get us in trouble, don't be too loud, don't be too pushy.
Better they should get elected
Yes.
instead of we should
Yes,
get elected.
and so it was sort of the court Jew who was always behind the throne but never on the throne. That no longer applies, and not only that, but we now have senators and congressmen from states where the Jewish population is almost a minus population rather than a plus population.
You talk about that. Yet at the same time, there are still the canards. Jews control the banks. Jews
Oh,
control the media. Jews
yes.
control this. Do you find Jews less willing to tolerate that, or
Yes, far less willing. I think several things. I think Jews are far more willing to stand up now and knock anti-Semitism rather than go hide from it or say be quiet. I think, I know at Harvard University, for instance, the amount of yarmulkes, I'm still on that side of the generational gap that calls it a yarmulke, not a kippah, that people wear unabashedly and without any shame at all. And I tell the story that I wore tzitzis and went to my high school to go swimming, and somebody saw it, and I was so embarrassed I never wore it again. And then there's another funny story about, I think it might be Larry King, I can't remember now, that they were wearing it, and somebody said, "What is that?" And they said, "A chest protector." And he gets a zoom, somebody hits him and says, and knocks him down. He says, "Some protection."
Larry King, Red Auerbach, you do interview several famous
Yes.
people, although you don't key this as a celebrity book.
No, I didn't want it to be a celebrity book.
Exactly. But who are the people you talk to, the famous folks, and why did you pick them? Any particular
Well, I
reason?
picked Larry King because he's an interesting person and he's had an interesting history. Grew up in Brooklyn, and I was looking for somebody who could articulate Brooklyn. Brooklyn, after all, is a Jewish word. I picked Dan Bell at Harvard, an eminent sociologist, because I wanted to capture that CCNY crowd in the 1930s, where that fervent intellect was boiling and roiling all the
Very
time among
left.
the Jewish students. Yes.
Very leftist.
And then I picked Barry Goldwater because I wanted to understand that aspect of you know, he says he had two Jewish aunts who wouldn't talk to him because he was Episcopalian, and they kept kosher right to the end. I picked on Bill Cohen because he had given up his Judaism, and I wanted to find out why. And he was very candid in telling why. I looked for a Tumblr. One of my great disappointments was not being able to find a Tumblr. Danny Kaye had promised me he was going to help me, and then unfortunately he died. Milton Berle was too busy. Jackie Mason said no. He was writing his own book. I couldn't find a Tumblr in the Catskills.
Maybe in the second edition. Who, I was going to ask, who famous turned you down, or why did people turn you down?
The most interesting turn down I had was an old news source of mine, Admiral Hyman Rickover. Rick had given a speech. I had heard that he had given a speech about his roots as a Russian immigrant and his Jewishness. So I called him up and I said, would he do it for me on tape for the book? And he said no. So we had a little banter back and forth between us. I knew him fairly well. And I said, well, is the story I had always heard in Washington, D.C. apocryphal or true that when you graduated from the United States Naval Academy, they perforated the page in the yearbook so that your classmates, if they didn't want to have a Jew in their class, could rip you out? And he says it's untrue. And then there was a pause. And then he said to me, but it was true about my classmate, Leonard Kaplan. And he went on to tell me the story that there was the brightest person in the class, whom he characterized as also obnoxious, who was cheated out of being number one, was on a page that was perforated. So my wife and I went to the U.S. I found out that Leonard Kaplan had died a year before I heard this story, went to the Academy, found the book, and sure enough, there's the perforation. And it's on a page that's very cleverly made up so that there's an anti-Semitic drawing across from Kaplan's photograph of a man whose nickname was Porky, born in the city of Zion in the county of Cork on St. Patrick's Day. And sure enough, you could just rip the page out and throw it away. Now, it was put in by the editor of the book, who was number one in the class. Jerry Olmsted, his name was. And he was reprimanded when this was all brought about, but the Academy swears there was no anti-Semitism, but if you look at it, it was clearly an anti-Semitic act.
Do you see the book as helping us lead our lives as Jews? How do you see it helping us?
Well, I should hope it would Well, let me tell you how I would wish it would work, all right? And then I'll tell you why I think it would help us. I interviewed a lot of people whom I would say to them, well, how did your family get here? And they would say, you know, I never asked my mother, and she's gone now, and I'm sorry. So what I'm hoping is that everybody who buys the book or hears about the book will grab a tape recorder, go find their parents or grandparents, sit them down, and you don't have to be a professional at it, you don't have to be a historian, you don't have to be a journalist. Ask them, how did they get here? What are the Bubamaises? A lot of the stories are apocryphal, a lot memory is faulty, a lot people pass down, but it's still memory, and it's still valuable, and children and grandchildren ought to have access to those tapes. So I am urging everybody to tape, and it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not Jewish, I think you ought to do it.
Become an oral historian.
Yes, of your own family.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two, I think there's a tenacity, a love of education, a love of country, a love of doing, a love of tzedakah that comes through in the book if you read it, and answers a lot of questions and tells a lot of stories that I hope is somewhat inspirational for people to go out and do again, taking advantage of all the opportunities of this country, which is a country that's provided opportunities in ways that you can't even begin to enumerate.
You end the book on a bit of a downer.
Yes, I do. I end the note on a cautionary interview with Ed Elson, who is a very successful businessman in Atlanta, Georgia, who serves on maybe 20 boards and committees, many of them pro bono, many doing very great works for the community, for Jewish community, for the non-Jewish community, for the country. And he says he cannot get into clubs. He's still barred from some clubs, and that gnaws at him. It's in his craw. He can't cough it up, and he can't swallow it, nor should he. But what I'm saying is that with all of the success and with all of the achievement, there still is this last obstacle.
For acceptance.
Do you ever think that will
Yes.
Go away. I think in time.
How much time?
Well, not in my lifetime.
You do tell a story also of famous sportscaster Marty Glickman, who recently received a lot of covet, a lot of kudos for prepping the first female football telecaster for the network. However, Marty Glickman, many of us in the field knew, was an Olympic sprinter from Syracuse University, but he never got to run.
No. He and a man by the name of Sam Stoller, whom I would love to find. I looked for him and couldn't find him. Were part of our relay team in 1936 in the games, Berlin. And about 2 or 3 days, Marty tells the story, about 2 or 3 days before the games, the coach came to him and said that the Germans have a secret relay team, and we're going to have to change our plans. So you, Marty, and you, Sam, the 2 Jewish boys on the team, you're not running. And you, Jesse Owens, and you, Ralph Metcalf, you are running. Jesse Owens stood up and said, now wait a minute, coach. Marty has been practicing passing the baton. It's a great team. I've won my 3 gold medals. Let Marty run. The coach, White, said, you sit down. Owens black, 1936, sits down. And I believe this is true, that Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller are the only athletes to go as part of an American Olympic team to the Olympics and not participate.
They never did run.
They never did run.
Was Marty hesitant to discuss that?
No, not with me. And then he tells the story in the book. He ends his story with the fact that a year later, Marty Glickman was the star back for the Syracuse University football team. They were going to play in the Baltimore City Stadium. On the backfield was a young black who was his roommate. Although the black's name was Singh, S-I-N-G-H, the Baltimore City Fathers come to the coach of the Syracuse team and say, blacks are not allowed to play here in 1937 in Baltimore. Marty says he should have stood up and said, if he doesn't play, I don't play, remembering what Jesse Owens did for him. But he didn't, because he didn't want to be labeled a crotchety, fetching Jew, because he complained bitterly at the Olympics. And so he never stood up, and to this day it haunts him.
Interesting story. Some people write as a catharsis for them. Listening to you, it seems not as something you had to get off your chest, but as a
It's something I wanted to
fulfillment-
put on my chest.
Something you wanted to put, exactly.
No, I loved it.
That
And-
you've
and-
always been identified.
Yes.
You've always been proud to be a Jew.
Absolutely.
But being a member of the media, of course, I couldn't let you go without starting to ask you these, the issues that so many people, ethnics, including Jews, are concerned about, and that is being a Jewish person in the mainstream media, in this case the Washington Post, which has been critical of Israel many times, and the community, of course, comes back and says to the Washington Post, what are you doing? How can you say this? And you, how much in the middle did you feel, or do you feel?
Well, I regarded myself not as a Jewish journalist, but as a journalist. And the fact that I was Jewish had very little to do with the fact that I was managing editor of the Washington Post. And so I would defend our coverage when I thought it merited defense, and argue as I would with any special interest group, whether it was Jews or blacks or Greeks or underdeveloped world or the third world or the people from Zaire.
Did it pain you privately when things were not written?
Well, of course, it always pained me, but it pains me even today in other newspapers. I backed my staff because, after all, I was partly responsible. And when I thought they were right, I backed them. And when I thought they were wrong, I would tell them privately, but I would certainly not criticize them publicly. I don't think that serves any useful manager's purpose.
You talk about the experiences other people have in the book, and you list a couple of yours. But if there was one, let's say someone were interviewing you for Jewish Times and wanted to get an experience that you wanted to share about your Jewishness, your Jewish upbringing, your Jewish soul, neshama. Got one?
Oh, God. Unlike Mr. Bush, Mr. Quayle, Mr. Dukakis, and Mr. Benson, I wasn't prepped for that question.
Well, that's good.
I know. It was just the fact that I thought that this was such a rich community that I grew up with, that I knew, and that I kept encountering, whether I encountered it as a science writer among scientists, whether I encountered it as an English major in college among writers and playwrights. There was no one thing other than, and my mother's humor. My mother was a very funny woman, an absolutely marvelously funny woman, and I thought that also was part of being Jewish, was being funny. And I still think that's true.
Well, David Brenner said he felt that being Jewish was funny because that way they wouldn't hurt you or hit you as bad, because look, I can make you laugh, I can let you dance. He might be a Talmud interview maybe in the second edition. Meanwhile, enjoy the first edition because it is a wonderful, a beautiful, and a classic, or will be, certainly. It's called Jewish Times, Voices of the American Jewish Experience. Howard Simons, it has been a pleasure to have you.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and I thank you.
We'll see you next time right here on the program. Thank you for joining us. Our guest has been Howard Simons, journalist, scholar, and author of Jewish Times. I'm Mike Leiderman. Have a good day.